What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here, and back to review the new Showtime Docuseries The Kings. The fourth and final episode airs this Sunday, but all 4 episodes, they're already available online on apps like Hulu if you have the Showtime add-on. And I'm going a bit out of my lane reviewing this show in that I typically focus on genre entertainment and film and television, but I am a massive fan of combat sports, so I thought it'd be fun to switch things up a bit and talk about this highly enjoyable series, as well as the 4 legendary boxers who defined the era of the 4 kings: Roberto Duran, Marvin Hagler, Sugar Ray Leonard, and Tommy Hearns. Now, I should emphasize in advance that I'm mostly an MMA fan. I watch MMA obsessively, almost at the exclusion of all other sports, but a little boxing does bleed into my diet through the various commentators that I follow, like Luke Thomas and Brian Campbell over at Morning Combat. And I do watch some boxing, but I'm a total casual on that front. But for that reason, The Kings was absolutely riveting viewing for me, in that the story of the epic contest between these 4 fighters was mostly brand new to me, because all 4 of these fighters were in their prime when I was still a really small child. That said, I wasn't totally clueless going into this show. The first fight that I can ever remember really being aware of as a kid was the 1987 fight between Hagler and Leonard, and even though I didn't follow the sport at all, they promoted the hell out of that event, and even then I knew that was going to be a giant piece of boxing history. Also, prior to this series, I'd already seen the brutal contest between Marvin Hagler and Tommy Hearns from 1985, probably because some YouTube algorithm sucked it up and sent it my way due to all the MMA content that I consume. Long story short, that fight absolutely fucking floored me, and if you were to watch only one boxing match ever, that fight would get my highest possible recommendation. It features what might be the most exciting first round in any fight that I've ever seen, and this show does the deep dive on that fight in episode 3. So what makes this show special, and why am I covering it on a channel that's mostly devoted to escapist entertainment? First and foremost, the show features 4 fascinating figures, each with their own incredible personal stories, but more importantly, this show highlights an era from the late 70s through the late 80s where the best fought the best. As commentator, trainer, and narrator Teddy Atlas states repeatedly in the doc, Fred Astaire was at his best when he had a great dance partner like Ginger Rogers, and the same holds true for boxers. At its best, the sport is this beautiful, graceful ballet of violence that reaches its pinnacle when 2 all-time greats collide. Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler, Roberto Duran, and Tommy Hearns, their confrontations with one another, these fights brought out the best in each of them, creating a period that for many boxing historians is one of the strongest in the history of the sport. These are the rivalries that turn champions into legends, icons, GOATs, all-time greats, whatever terminology you want to use, and you never really know how great these champions really are until they run into a brick wall and have to dig deep and find something in themselves that they might not have even known was there until they were truly tested. In one of the most astonishing contests featured in the series, we see the showdown between Sugar Ray Leonard and Tommy Hearns in 1981, where they fought to unify the WBA and WBC welterweight titles. And Leonard describes how during this fight, it was the closest thing he ever felt to dying in the ring. And we see Sugar Ray losing the fight early on. His left eye, it swells up horribly, but then he starts making adjustments late in the fight and ends up quite literally punching Tommy Hearns through the ropes. And then he ends up winning the fight by TKO in the 14th round. And as far as I'm concerned, it's impossible not to be deeply moved by the sight of Sugar Ray Leonard crying in his corner as his trainer gives him some really tough love late in the fight, but it's that advice which enables him to prevail over such an indomitable opponent. And I'm a giant movie freak. I've seen many boxing movies and I love a lot of them, but there's nothing quite like watching a real come-from-behind victory in real life. One of the major highlights for me watching the show was getting to learn more about Roberto Duran, otherwise known as Hands of Stone, because I knew about his notorious no-mas fight when he abruptly quit in the 8th round during a second fight with Sugar Ray Leonard, but I'd never seen any of his fights before at all. And he is just astonishing to watch in action. He's so brutal, so tough, and like many of his American peers, came from an incredibly poor background, so much so that his American rivals state that the conditions Duran experienced in Panama as a kid make poverty in America seem like middle class by comparison. And I loved getting to hear him describe the wild lifestyle that he led in between fights, how he would drink and eat aggressively, oftentimes making it nearly impossible for him to make weight for his next fight, or when he admits to basically indulging in this drunken orgy in a hotel room for a week straight in Miami, leading up to his fight with Tommy Hearns, resulting in a crushing defeat at the hands of the Hitman. Now, a lot of folks inevitably are going to compare this show with The Last Dance, and I'd urge people to tap the brakes before making that comparison. I really enjoyed watching watching The Kings, but from a pure filmmaking standpoint, The Last Dance is far superior. And this is coming from someone who could not care less about basketball, and yet I still ended up watching The Last Dance twice in its entirety. I can only imagine how basketball fans felt about that series. But what I think is important to remember is that you should never conflate the power of the individual clips in a docuseries and kind of give credit for them to the director, in this case, Matt Whitecross. And Whitecross, he did a great job with the show, but he's also working with some of the most memorable fights ever witnessed by human beings. But where Whitecross occasionally gets himself into trouble is with this political narrative that he's constructing throughout the series. And I'd argue that the political side of the series, it works about as often as it doesn't. On one hand, it's absolutely vital to understand where these fighters come from, what were the conditions on the ground, and how did these fighters reflect the period in which they were fighting, and how did they define the period in which they were fighting. But what ends up happening periodically throughout the show is that Whitecross, he goes off on these massive tangents about things like the struggles of the automobile industry in Detroit, or the battle over the fate of the Panama Canal. And then it takes him forever to get back to the stories of the four fighters at the heart of the series. And in the end, this is a series about The Kings. This is not a documentary trying to capture the entire political history of the 1980s. And at times it feels like the director perhaps might be more interested in making a different documentary series, but he just happened to be hired to do this one. And if I have to choose between a few minutes of screen time about the ups and downs of Reaganomics versus a few more minutes of watching Marvin Hagler beat the holy shit out of people, I'm going with the latter. 4 episodes is not a ton of screen time to work with when you're covering these 4 careers, and I wouldn't have minded far more footage from their fights. Plus, I feel like Hagler, may he rest in peace, didn't get quite enough screen time, or maybe I'm just biased because for whatever reason, I found myself rooting for him the most. So overall, I felt like some of the political sermonizing in this show, it does help flesh out the era in which these fights take place. In particular, how Sugar Ray was leading this double life as Golden Boy in the public eye and doing all these talk shows and commercials, etc. While in his private life, he was aggressively partying behind the scenes, spending millions on cocaine. His success story and his lifestyle, it exemplifies so much about the culture of excess of the 1980s. And it's a key part to understanding his story. So like I said, the political side of the series, it works about as often as it distracts. But all that stuff aside, I can't wait to watch this show again. There are scenes where these athletes demonstrate so much astonishing hand speed, so much power, and so much grace and dexterity that I frequently found myself yelling in surprise and joy and jumping out of my chair. I mean, I could not believe some of the footage I was seeing, especially highlights of Sugar Ray when he's fighting Floyd Mayweather Sr., or his massive brawl with Hagler where it looks like Leonard's on his way out and suddenly he'll just come back with a flurry of punches. This is glorious, epic stuff. And what's interesting is seeing how these fighters, when they start to age and their skills start to fade just a little bit and some of their defensive skills start to atrophy, we get what are arguably some of the most memorable fights of their careers where they're showing nothing but heart. And what's crazy now in 2021 is how much longer a fighter's career can be. When Leonard and Hearns had their rematch in 1989, Hearns was 30 and Leonard was 32, but at that time, all people could talk about was how Tommy Hearns' chin was gone or that he didn't have any power in his legs anymore. Nowadays, especially in MMA, they'd be considered in their absolute prime at the peak of their game. So as you can tell from the tone of my voice, I absolutely love this show. For whatever reason, over the last 20 years or so, I've just gotten really into combat sports. And combat sports, they've oftentimes been described as the red light district of sports, but that's probably why I enjoy watching them so much. There's this sense of danger and taboo and excitement that I don't feel at all when watching other sports, so who knows? Maybe in the future on this channel I'll start doing more videos on movies and shows about combat sports. Let me know what you think in the comments below if you'd like to see me tackle more material on this front. But like I said, episode 4 airs this Sunday, but the full series is already available online. But I can't thank you enough for watching this review. I really appreciate it. If you want to talk more about combat sports or whatever, you can always find me on Twitter at Geeking Out. Please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, all that wonderful, beautiful stuff. But thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.